All right. I hope this thing is working. Yeah, I think it is. Okay, great. All right, Adam, thanks for hopping on so quickly with me.
Sure, anytime.
So let's jump in. I'm on stage with Brett Stevens at the 92nd Street Y a couple of weeks ago for our annual State of World Jewry, and Brett basically says in front of a live audience that, or he made 4 points, but one of the points was that Jews should stop investing in anti-Semitism education and trying to eradicate anti-Semitism because it's going to be around forever. It's futile. There's kind of like a never-ending. It's a bottomless pit. We're never going to convince, and so we should resource ourselves towards proud Jewish life, towards Jewish thriving. And so you responded strongly on social media. You want to unpack a little bit of what you were saying and what your critique was of Stephen's of his points.
Yeah, so first of all, I think it's completely legitimate to always be investing in Jewish continuity, in Jewish civilization, in a thriving Jewish life where people are knowledgeable about Judaism and Jewish texts. Now, of course, this whole discussion about assimilation, the American Jewish community becoming less involved, affiliated, observant, right? That conversation has existed for 50 years, maybe even more. Maybe it's something that always exists for Jews at any time. There was the danger of Jews assimilating in Egypt, but as we know, they kept their clothes and their specific language, and the Jews didn't assimilate, right? So that's just kind of an ongoing, ever-present Jewish concern. But now we are in a very particular moment, right? It's 2 years after October 7th. A lot has changed. So what I found disturbing was the call to kind of repeat this ever present kind of um, question of assimilation at a time when we really need to be dealing with the punctual, real, contemporary issues we're facing. And I see that as the explosion of anti Zionist hate since October 7th, the explosion of a movement that treats Israel as inherently evil, inherently genocidal, colonial apartheid, and attacks Jews as so called Zionists throughout the world and tries to eliminate Israel. Right? That is what is happening. And to just kind of look at it and say, people will always hate us, I don't think it really grasps the contemporary moment.
Right. So if it were up to you, you would. I imagine I'm just gonna put words into your mouth here, but you tell me if I'm wrong, and I think I agree with you wholeheartedly. So I just want to make sure that we're on the same page. So you're not saying that the anti-Semitism that once was being displayed, and that we were fighting against, and that we are on the lookout for. You're not arguing that we should divert resources towards that. You're saying that might, like you might agree with that, but you are making an important point, which is the anti-Semitism that we used to fight is not the anti-Semitism that we have to fight now. And the anti-Semitism that we've seen is it's a new, right, what Rabbi Jonathan Sachs called a new viral mutation of this. This is like that our focus should be on anti-Zionism as
Mm-hmm.
the new world, the new anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism, and that we are missing the mark in our addressing that, and that's something that we should be attacking as a community, and we should be diverting resources towards. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So I think if Stevens is going to say that fighting anti-Semitism has failed, I think he's right, right? But for the wrong reasons. It hasn't failed because you can't do anything about it, right? Like it's one thing to say that anti-Jewish hatred has always existed, and it's another thing to say you can't do anything about it because it goes in cycles where it becomes much more intense and dangerous, and at other times it exists, but it's a manageable level, right? And so to fight anti-Jewish hatred is not to eliminate it completely. It's just to try and get it back down to a manageable level where it's not harming Jews, right? And anti-Zionists have committed murders in the United States. We had an anti-Zionist, Elias Rodriguez, who murdered Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Milgram outside of an AJC event in Washington D.C. And I just can't, I can't just sit back and say, well, we can't do anything about that, right? Like that seems to be actually contradictory to the Torah, right? Like lo ta'amod al dam ra'echa. You don't stand by, as your people are being killed, right? So, but the problem has been that we have only focused on anti-Semitism. We haven't focused on anti-Zionism, and that's why fighting anti-Semitism has failed. So there have been two responses, right, in the Jewish community. One has been to affirm Brett Stevens' position, and say, yes, we should just focus on Jewish continuity. The other has been to say, we should keep fighting anti-Semitism, but neither of these positions point to fighting anti-Zionism. And I think that is the key shift that needs to happen as a response to the changed conditions since October 7th.
Question for me though is like I think one of the reasons why people don't think of anti-Zionism as something that should be fought in quite the same way is because it's clear, right? It's clear that there are anti-Zionists we have historical Jewish anti-Zionists. We have anti-Zionism as a pre-state phenomena was quite common, right? In the world leading up to the establishment of the state of Israel, there were multiple camps, and there are academics and there are others who would argue that there is a history of anti-Zionism as not, and it's clearly not anti-Semitic. It's kind of those who argue against an ethno-state or see it as an ethno-state or argue against nationalism and so on. There's kind of all kinds of anti-Semitism is a much clearer enemy, and anti-Zionism in its current valence, right, has a lot of Jewish support, or it has plenty of Jews who are willing to sit at the table of anti-Zionists, and there are people who are part of the mayor of New York City who's an anti-Zionist, and they're part of his coalition and alliance. So I think maybe I wondered if one of the reasons why it's not as clear. I'm sure Brett Stevens would agree with you that anti-Zionism is a very blatant form of anti-Semitism. But I imagine that some of the reason or the reticence to kind of go all in on that has to do with what it might mean consequentially for those whom would argue, well, hey, listen, I just don't, I'm Peter Beinart, and I'm anti-Zionist because I think it should be a one-state solution. And I think that Israel is, whatever the reasons are. So I think that I wonder for you if you have to unpack for many, like some of the things that you've been writing on social media that I think are very, very, I personally think very, very smart and very, very nuanced about how this isn't, like anti-Zionism is not, it's really, it's where this next iteration is going to happen. And notwithstanding all of these really good people who might be arguing from a place of ivory tower or academic perspective or some kind of historical perspective, there's an insidious way that you're arguing that anti-Zionism has set up some significant dangers for Jews in the Western world because of the way that it's borrowed from here and there, and that it's we haven't even seen its full teeth yet. So I don't know if that speaks to you at all.
Yeah. So obviously, the big issue we have is Jewish anti-Zionists and the tokenization of Jewish anti-Zionists. Like whether that's happening today in the present, because there are some Jews who join the anti-Zionist hate movement, or it's a kind of historical argument, as you're saying. Well, there were Jews pre-1948 who were anti-Zionist. They opposed the creation of Israel. What I've tried to do by isolating anti-Zionism as a coherent ideology and writing it without a hyphen, so it's not just in opposition to Zionism, it's actually just its own kind of complex of ideas, and distinguishing it from anti-Zion with hyphen, is I've tried to trace the genealogy of where the central ideas that anti-Zionists repeat all the time come from. And the ideas they repeat all the time is that Israel is a colonial, apartheid, and genocidal state. Now, if you isolate it that way, and the reason I'm doing this is not academic. It's because I see anti-Zionists attacking people they mark as Zionists and calling them slurs, calling them Zio-Nazis, white colonizers, etc. Right? But if you trace those concepts, right, they actually don't come from Jewish anti-Zionism. So one of the great lies, it's actually a kind of trick of words, right? Because the Jews pre-1948 who rejected Zionism called themselves anti-Zionists, and the people today call themselves anti-Zionists. Oh, well, it must be the same thing, right? Because they used the same word, and they're both sort of opposed to Zionism. In actual fact, the core ideological content of anti-Zionism without the hyphen just doesn't come from Jewish anti-Zionism, right? It comes from the Nazi Islamist axis and the Mufti of Jerusalem, who was allied with the Nazis and propagated Islamic anti-Judaism, propagated the protocols of the Elders of Zion and spread it through the Middle East, so that conspiratorial anti-Semitic constructs of the World Zionist Organization as a master plan to displace Arabs, right? These kinds of anti-Judaic and anti-Semitic traditions actually went into forming these libels, right? The apartheid libel you can trace in Arab nationalist literature and the Soviets, right? It came from concepts of Jewish chosenness, Jews as racial arrogance, superior to other people, hating other people, anti-Judaic canards were built into the apartheid libel. The genocide libel comes from the Soviets doing Holocaust inversion, saying, well, the Israelis are really the Nazis, they're the fascists, etc., and fitting that to their left-wing Marxist view. So if you look at anti-Zionism and you deconstruct it and show where it comes from, it's actually just not the same. But the problem is there hasn't been enough thematization of anti-Zionism and education about anti-Zionism for people to understand that these two things are not the same.
Let's talk about the Super Bowl. Okay, so look at this ad that's been getting a lot of
Yeah.
play now, right? So a lot of people look at this ad and they think, okay, here's an ad that is playing to so many different tropes that it misses the mark in terms of its efficacy or or in terms of what it needs to do in the world. I mean, there was a colleague, Yehuda Kurtzer, wrote that on his Facebook feed that the halftime show of Bad Bunny did more to combat anti-Semitism potentially than that ad did because of the one slogan that said, like, the ultimate, what is it, that ultimate, hate is more powerful than love, love is more powerful than hate. Not hate is more powerful than love, but love is more powerful than hate. And that the kind of multicultural embracing of difference, that kind of thing, obviously the Bad Bunny's halftime show was trying to underscore kind of a counter narrative to the nativist and populist vision of the current American government. So where are you on that ad? Like, I mean, the ad was like, here's this ad, and it essentially says, here's this weak kid or this kind of nebbish-looking Jewish kid who has this encounter with haters, and then a black kid comes over and puts a blue sticky on top and says of the sticky that says "Dirty Jew," and says, I know what this is like. Essentially, alliance across marginal people, black people, Jews were kind of marginalized. I'll stick up for you. More, there'll be power because I'll give you cover. Would you have been? Would you have been if you were making the ad? What would you have made it? Would have been about like Israel? Would have been like they wouldn't have just been calling me a dirty Jew. They'd be calling me a dirty Zionist.
Yeah.
And right, yeah, that's kind of the way you would have framed it, because that's really where the fault lines are now. Not Christian or kind of MAGA-ish, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, dirty Jew kind of thing. It's more about Israel.
Yeah, so I would center anti-Zionism. The sticker would say white colonizer or genocide supporter. Um, Now, in saying that, it's not because I think there's no such thing as classical anti-Semitism anymore, or as you say, right-wing, kind of anti-Talmudic, anti-Judaism. That stuff's all come back, with Christ killer. All this stuff has come back with a force, but I think it's happening within the larger permission structure created by anti-Zionism since October 7th. It's also easier to notice, right? So the educational work that we need to do is about anti-Zionism. So I would maybe also have an ad that kind of actually showed people, I don't know exactly how you would depict it, showed people in academic departments at Columbia, writing about settler colonialism, and then showed someone in the UN sort of saying Israel's committing genocide. And then you see all that, or you see a New York Times article, right, that says Holocaust scholar says it's genocide. And then behind all that sort of official looking, respectable stuff, you see, what I experienced in the academy, right? Is people actually who are not respectable, they are bullies, right? And they're just going to go, you're a white colonizer, genocide supporter, get out of our club, no Zionists allowed, right? So I would connect those things together. I'd show the predominant libels and tropes today, and I'd show how they're being laundered in mainstream discourse. And that's really the permission structure for these cruder forms of anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism that are appearing, right? So I think that some people grasped that, but then I found that the ADL's response was very bizarre, right? It was actually kind of disturbing as well. They said, well, because the ADL was supportive of the Kraft ad, and they did a test to a random sample of Americans, and then said, well, after this random sample of Americans, we put it next to a control group, and there was like 8% more people who said they would intervene in anti-Semitism. So it works. Right. And the ad's not for Jews, it's for non-Jews. So what you Jews think about this ad doesn't really matter. We know better. We have the technical data. I found that very strange because, first of all, even if these people say we'll intervene in anti-Semitism, what do they mean by anti-Semitism? If that means that they will intervene when someone's called a dirty Jew, maybe that's helpful, but they certainly won't intervene when someone is called a white colonizer or a genocide supporter, right? So I think that message testing approach, it seems very smart, objective because it uses data, but it's based on premises that are incorrect.
Feels like an argument on a zero sum level. I mean, it's clear that what Brett was saying is that we should not. I think it was a bit odd what Brett was saying. I think that ultimately, there's some truth to what Brett was arguing for, which is that so often Jews are comfortable playing the role of victim or comfortable being those who frequently buy into these tropes, right? We ourselves spend inordinate amounts of money and time on being hated or trying to build a world where we won't be hated or seeing ourselves through the eyes of those who do hate us, and then trying our best not to be hated. And so he was a bit arguing. I said this on the stage. David Hartman said this a lot about Judaism decades ago, that in the world of Auschwitz versus Sinai, we focus too much of our energies on the idea that the world hates us and then building an identity around that instead of what we've offered the world and being proud about our Jewishness and the world can care or not, we're just going to be who we are. And somewhere in that place, and Stevens was kind of talking about Jewish identity formed from that here, especially in the diaspora, where Jews have often a very thin Jewish identity. Let's focus on thickening that. That itself will, that's what we need to do. But meanwhile, he was saying it on the stage where we had huge security and the privilege of being safe. He could talk about that from a place of privilege where we're essentially, walking around with a legion of defenses and so on. That's one piece. And then there's the zero sum game of like, we need to also do what you're saying, which is focus on this anti-Zionism piece as well. And that it's not enough, right, just to talk about anti-Semitism without also including what the images that you provided. I was just listening to a podcast with Chaviv Gore, who was talking to Jonah Platt about Jewish identity in the United States and the Yale survey, where 24% of those within a certain age group said that I think they were asked 3 different questions about Jewish identity, to gauge their level of anti-Semitism, or like one of them was like, "Are Jews?" Anyway, I'm not going to talk about it now, but I think we have a problem. How would you address this problem of that generation? Because I think another upshot of focusing on anti-Zionism is the potential of losing those who have been caught in that ideological trap, right? And I think there's a fear here. Like, what do we do with all these kids who have already been infected with anti-Zionism and who have been trained in the universities where to see themselves? This problem of Jewish anti-Zionism is not just a problem in terms of like the legitimacy of it or the permission structure, as you called it. It's also next generation Jews, like losing them, right? Like literally casting them out and excising them from the community. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. And I think to get them back, we actually really need to flip the tables, right? And show anti-Zionism as an injustice and as a bigotry, right? Because these left-wing Jews, right, they are not interested in something that seems right-wing, that seems Trump associated, right? That is not presented to them in the, cultural language of anti-oppression discourse that they understand, right? It's presented to them, it's top down, it comes from the government, it comes from corporate, highly professionalized Jewish organizations. It doesn't seem spontaneous, it doesn't seem trendy, it just doesn't seem contemporary, right? So if we want to bring them back to connection to their Jewish identity and to connection to Israel, because honestly, I don't believe that the kind of so-called anti-Zionist diasporist Jewish identity they're creating will last, because I think it's really just a form of pandering ultimately to anti-Jewish, anti-Zionism. We'll see, we don't know. But if we want to really bring them back, we have to show them that anti-Zionism is an oppression, and that they can also maintain their support for Palestinians by opposing anti-Zionism. Because in practice, anti-Zionism is harming Palestinians. It's driving endless war. It's supporting extremism. It's supporting Hamas's oppression of the Palestinian people and the oppression of other peoples, the anti-Zionist regime in Tehran that is oppressing and murdering, Iranians, right? So if they really want to support justice, right, they have to oppose anti-Zionism. But to do that, we need to speak about anti-Zionism in ways that show contemporaneity and cultural fluency.